The night was suffocating, not from heat, but from tension so thick you could taste it on your tongue like metal. The island's humidity wrapped around every Marine like a second skin, mixing with the sweat that had nothing to do with temperature. Lieutenant James Morrison crouched in the foxhole, his fingers trembling slightly as they hovered near his rifle trigger. Above him, the Pacific sky was a canvas of stars that seemed almost mockingly peaceful. Behind those stars, somewhere in the darkness of the jungle canopy, 2,000 Japanese soldiers were moving into position. Intelligence had confirmed it an hour ago. 2,000 men against their battalion of 450 Marines dug into defensive positions along Henderson Ridge. The numbers didn't favor survival. What happened next would become one of the most controversial and strategically brilliant decisions in Marine Corps history. When the order came down to hold fire, to let the enemy advance within killing distance before engaging, every man questioned whether they'd live to see dawn. But what those Marines accomplished that night, how they turned mathematics and darkness into weapons more lethal than bullets, would be studied in military academies for generations to come. If you want to hear stories of courage, strategy, and survival from history's greatest conflicts, hit that like button and subscribe to never miss these incredible true accounts. Morrison had enlisted 3 years earlier in Chicago, back when the war felt like something happening on newspaper pages rather than in the flesh and blood reality of combat. His father had fought in the Great War, came home with lungs scarred by mustard gas and stories he never finished telling. James thought he understood what war meant. He was wrong. Nothing prepared you for the weight of knowing 2,000 men wanted you dead and were willing to die trying. Nothing prepared you for the responsibility of keeping the 18-year-old kid next to you alive when he still had acne and talked about his girlfriend back in Ohio like she was the only real thing left in the world. The defensive line stretched along a ridge overlooking a valley choked with kunai grass and scattered palm trees. Colonel Marcus Henderson, the man the ridge was named after, had chosen this position 3 weeks earlier after pushing Japanese forces back from their supply depot. Henderson was a tactician who'd studied Thermopylae and the Alamo, not for their heroic failures, but for their strategic lessons. He understood that terrain could multiply force, that patience could sharpen steel, and that sometimes the bravest thing soldiers could do was nothing at all. The order came through the command chain at 2200 hours. Morrison heard it through his company commander, Captain Robert Chen, a second-generation Chinese-American from San Francisco who'd fought harder than anyone to prove his loyalty when war broke out. Chen's voice was steady as he gathered the platoon leaders, but Morrison saw the tightness around his eyes. "Gentlemen, intelligence indicates a major assault forming up in the valley. Estimates put their force at 2,000, possibly more. They'll hit us before dawn." Chen paused, letting that sink in. "Colonel Henderson's orders are explicit. We hold fire until they reach the marked positions. Not a single shot until they're inside the kill zone." "Sir, that puts them within 50 yards. This from Lieutenant Davies, a farm boy from Iowa, who'd killed his first man at Guadalcanal and hadn't slept properly since. They could overwhelm our positions." "That's the point, Lieutenant. We let them think they can." Chen unfolded a map across an ammunition crate, using his flashlight sparingly. Red marks indicated their defensive positions. Blue marks showed the kill zone. "The Colonel's betting on 2 things. 1, their intelligence is as good as ours, meaning they know our numbers. They'll come confident, expecting to overrun us with mass. 2, in darkness, disciplined fire from prepared positions beats chaotic assault every time, but only if we're patient." Morrison studied the map. The killing ground was a natural amphitheater, the valley floor rising gently toward their ridge. The Japanese would have to cross 300 yards of open ground after emerging from the jungle. Henderson had positioned machine gun nests in interlocking fields of fire. Mortars were pre-sighted on specific coordinates. Every rifleman had a designated sector with range cards marking exact distances. It was a perfect defensive setup, but it required every Marine to trust the plan and hold their nerve. "What if they don't come through the valley?" Morrison asked. "What if they split their force, hit us from multiple directions?" "Then we adapt." But Colonel Henderson studied their previous assaults. They favor concentrated mass attacks, especially at night. They believe in overwhelming force applied at a single point. We're going to use that doctrine against them. The waiting was the hardest part. Morrison moved through his section of the line, checking positions, making sure ammunition was distributed, that water canteens were full. The Marines were quiet, that particular silence that comes before combat when every man retreats into his own thoughts. Private Tommy Sullivan, the kid from Ohio, was running his rosary beads through his fingers, lips moving in silent prayer. Sergeant Mike Kowalski, a pre-war factory worker from Detroit, was methodically cleaning his Browning automatic rifle for the third time, his movements mechanical and soothing. The defensive preparations had taken 3 days of backbreaking work. Every Marine had dug his foxhole deep enough to provide cover from mortar fire, reinforced with sandbags filled with the volcanic soil that characterized this godforsaken island. They'd cleared fields of fire, removing vegetation that could provide cover to an advancing enemy. Henderson had personally inspected each position, adjusting angles, repositioning machine guns to eliminate dead zones where attackers could advance unseen. Morrison remembered those 3 days with a clarity that surprised him. The blisters on his hands from digging, the way the sun beat down mercilessly during the day while they worked. The taste of lukewarm water from canteens that never seemed full enough. Chen had pushed them hard, knowing that every hour spent preparing could mean the difference between living and dying when the assault came. During those preparation days, they'd also rehearsed. Henderson insisted on it. Night after night, they'd run through scenarios. What if the enemy came from the east instead of the north? What if they had armor support? What if they tried to infiltrate rather than assault? Each scenario was war-gamed, solutions proposed, contingencies planned. Some Marines grumbled about the extra work when they could be sleeping. Morrison had been one of them, until Chen pulled him aside. "You see what the Colonel's doing, Lieutenant? He's not just preparing positions. He's preparing minds. When the real attack comes, and it will come, these men won't freeze. They'll react from training, from muscle memory. They'll trust the plan because they've executed it a dozen times already, even if it was just rehearsal." Chen had been right. Now, waiting in the darkness, Morrison could feel that preparation settling over him like armor. He knew exactly where his sectors of fire were. He knew which Marines were to his left and right, what weapons they carried, their strengths and weaknesses. He knew that if he called for supporting fire, the mortar teams had coordinates already plotted. Everything that could be controlled had been controlled. All that remained was to execute. But knowing the plan and executing it under pressure were different things entirely. Morrison had seen it before, in earlier engagements. Men who performed flawlessly in training, who froze when bullets started flying, others who seemed mediocre in practice, but turned into fierce fighters when lives were on the line. You never really knew what someone was made of until they were tested. He reached Corporal Eddie Martinez's position, a 2-man foxhole on the left flank. Martinez was from Los Angeles, had worked in his family's restaurant before the war. He'd brought that work ethic to the Marines, always the first to volunteer for extra duty, always looking out for the younger guys. Next to him was Private First Class Johnny Chen, Captain Chen's younger brother. The captain had tried to get Johnny transferred to another unit, didn't want the complication of commanding his own brother in combat, but Johnny had insisted on staying, and the colonel had allowed it. "How you holding up, Sully?" Morrison knelt beside Sullivan's foxhole. "Scared shitless, sir. Begging your pardon. Sullivan's voice cracked slightly. 2,000 of them. I keep doing the math. That's more than 4 to 1. Math doesn't account for stupidity, kid. They're walking into a trap because they think numbers are all that matter. We've got training, position, and a plan. That's worth more than 10 to 1 odds. Morrison didn't know if he believed his own words, but Sullivan needed to hear them. My girl Betty, she writes me every week. I got 3 letters today. Must have been held up somewhere. She wants to get married when I get home. Wants to have 4 kids and live in a house with a porch. Sullivan laughed nervously. Stupid to think about that now, right? That's exactly what you should think about. That's what you're fighting for. You keep Betty and that porch in your mind, and you do your job. Your job right now is to wait. Then when the order comes, you aim true, and you don't stop until they do. You understand me? Yes, sir. Sullivan's hands had stopped shaking. Sometimes all a man needed was to be told his fear was normal, that the things he cared about mattered. Morrison pulled one of Betty's letters from Sullivan's breast pocket, the envelope worn from repeated reading. Tell me about her. What's she like? Sullivan's face softened even in the darkness. She's a nurse back home, works at Cleveland General. That's how we met, actually. I broke my arm playing football senior year. She was doing her training rotation. She's got this laugh, Lieutenant. Sounds like music. And she's tough. Tougher than me, probably. Her dad didn't want her dating some Irish kid with no college plans. But she didn't care. Said she knew what she wanted. Sounds like a woman worth fighting for. She is, sir. She really is. Sullivan tucked the letter back into his pocket, close to his heart. You got anyone back home, Lieutenant? Morrison thought of Mary, the girl he'd dated before shipping out. She'd written for the first 6 months, then the letters stopped coming. He'd heard through a mutual friend that she'd married a 4F, a guy with flat feet who couldn't serve. He didn't blame her. The war had no timeline, no guarantee he'd ever come home. She'd chosen certainty over waiting for someone who might never return. Not anymore, Sully, but that's all right. Gives me one less thing to worry about out here. He moved on before Sullivan could ask more questions. The truth was, it did bother him. Not Mary specifically, but what she represented. The life he'd left behind was moving on without him. Friends were graduating college, starting careers, getting married, having kids. Meanwhile, he was on a volcanic rock in the middle of the Pacific, waiting to kill or be killed by people he'd never met and had no personal quarrel with. The disconnect was jarring when he let himself think about it, so mostly he didn't. Morrison moved on, repeating variations of the same conversation down the line. Leadership in combat wasn't about grand speeches. It was about these small moments, these individual connections that turned fear into purpose. Every man had his Betty, his reason for wanting to see dawn. He found Kowalski near the center of their defensive line, the bar positioned perfectly to enfilade any approach up the valley. The sergeant had stopped cleaning his weapon and was now just sitting, staring out into the darkness. Morrison settled in beside him without speaking. Sometimes presence was enough. After a few minutes, Kowalski broke the silence. You think Henderson knows what he's doing, Lieutenant, letting them get that close? The colonel hasn't been wrong yet. There's a first time for everything. Kowalski pulled out a photograph, handling it carefully. Even in the dim starlight, Morrison could make out a woman and 2 small children. My wife, Sarah. Kids are 6 and 4 now. Haven't seen them in 18 months. Tommy, the older one, he probably wouldn't even recognize me. You'll see them again, Mike. We're going to execute the plan, hold this ridge, and when the war's over, you'll go home to Detroit and pick up where you left off. Will we, though? Pick up where we left off? Kowalski's voice carried a weight Morrison recognized. It was the voice of a man who'd seen too much, done too much, and wasn't sure he could ever be the person he'd been before. I keep wondering if Sarah's going to recognize me. Not my face, but me. The guy who left was a factory worker who complained about his boss and played with his kids and thought the biggest problem in the world was making rent. The guy going back, I don't even know who that is anymore. Morrison didn't have an answer for that. It was a question every combat veteran faced, the gap between who they'd been and who they'd become. One thing at a time, Mike. Right now we focus on the next few hours. The rest we figure out when we get there. Kowalski nodded, tucking the photograph back into his shirt pocket. You're right, one thing at a time. Morrison continued his rounds, checking on Martinez and Johnny Chen, on Davies and his platoon, on the machine gun teams and the mortar crews. Everywhere he went, he found the same mixture of fear and determination. These weren't professional soldiers who'd trained for years. Most had been civilians 2 or 3 years ago, ordinary men thrust into extraordinary circumstances. But they'd adapted, learned, become a cohesive unit through shared hardship and training. That unity would be tested tonight. At 2300 hours, the jungle came alive with sounds. Not the usual night chorus of insects and birds, but something else. Movement. The rustle of equipment, the soft tread of many feet trying to be quiet. Morrison settled into his position, a shallow trench reinforced with sandbags, and peered into the darkness. His night vision had adjusted over the past hour. The valley was a sea of shadows, but he could make out the tree line 200 yards out. Then he saw them. Dark shapes emerging from the jungle, dozens at first, then hundreds. They moved in loose formation, rifles held ready, advancing with the confidence of superior numbers. Morrison's heart hammered against his ribs. Every instinct screamed to fire, to cut them down while they were exposed. But Henderson's order held. Wait, let them come. Beside him, Kowalski whispered, They're in the open, Lieutenant. We could drop 50 before they knew what hit them. Hold your fire, Sergeant. Pass it down. The Japanese force continued to advance. Morrison could see them more clearly now, individual soldiers moving through the kunai grass. They were well trained, maintaining intervals, weapons ready. These weren't green troops. This was a serious assault force that expected to take the ridge and probably expected casualties doing it. What they didn't expect was walking into a perfectly calibrated killing field. 200 yards. Morrison heard someone down the line chamber around, the metallic click impossibly loud. Hold your fire, he hissed. 150 yards. The Japanese advance continued. Some were talking now, quiet voices carrying across the valley. They thought they were being stealthy. They had no idea every step was monitored, that every Marine on the ridge had them in their sights, that the only thing keeping them alive was Henderson's discipline and timing. 100 yards. The lead elements were clearly visible now. Morrison could see their faces, young men like his own Marines, probably scared beneath their determination, probably thinking about their own families and homes. War stripped away abstractions. At this distance, the enemy became human again, and that made what came next both harder and more necessary. 75 yards. The radio in Chen's command post crackled once. Morrison couldn't hear the words, but he knew what they were. The entire Japanese force was committed now, streaming out of the jungle into the valley. 2,000 men in the open, packed into the killing zone with nowhere to go but forward or back into the jungle they'd just left. 50 yards. Morrison could hear their equipment jingling, could hear officers giving quiet orders. Then cutting through the night like a blade, Henderson's voice over the radio network, calm and clear. All units, light them up! The ridge erupted. Dozens of machine guns opened fire simultaneously, their muzzle flashes turning night into stuttering daylight. Mortar teams dropped rounds down tubes in rapid succession. Every rifle joined in, 450 Marines firing in disciplined, controlled bursts into a target-rich environment. The effect was catastrophic. The Japanese assault didn't just stall, it shattered. Men fell in waves as interlocking fire swept the valley. Those who survived the initial volley tried to advance, but ran into curtains of lead. Others attempted to retreat, but the jungle tree line was 300 yards of open ground away. There was nowhere to go. Morrison fired mechanically, his training taking over. Aim, squeeze, acquire next target. The bar next to him hammered away, Kowalski working the weapon like an instrument of destruction. Sullivan was firing too, his fear transformed into focused action. The valley had become hell-made visible. Tracers cutting orange lines through darkness, explosions throwing up dirt and body parts, screams that would haunt dreams for years rising above the gunfire. But this wasn't random violence. This was controlled. Devastating firepower applied with precision. Henderson had trained them for this. Overlapping fields of fire meant no dead ground. Pre-sighted mortars meant rounds landed exactly where they needed to. Discipline meant no wasted ammunition, no wild shooting, just methodical execution of a defensive plan. The Japanese tried to organize. Morrison saw officers waving swords, trying to rally their men for a charge. Machine gun fire cut them down. Some soldiers made it within 30 yards of the Marine positions, close enough that Morrison could see their faces contorted in fury and fear. They died there, unable to close the final distance. 20 minutes into the fight, the Japanese assault began to break. Survivors were pulling back, dragging wounded when they could, leaving bodies when they couldn't. Morrison's rifle was almost too hot to hold. Around him, Marines were swapping out barrels on machine guns, calling for more ammunition. The valley was carpeted with bodies and wounded men crying out in Japanese. "Cease fire! Cease fire!" Chen's voice cut through the chaos. The guns fell silent. The sudden quiet was deafening, broken only by the moans of wounded and the ringing in everyone's ears. Morrison slumped against the sandbags. His hands were shaking now, the adrenaline beginning to fade. Around him, Marines were doing the same, the reality of what they'd just done settling over them like a weight. The air smelled of cordite and blood, a combination that would haunt their nightmares for years. Sullivan was vomiting over the side of his foxhole, his body rejecting the violence it had just participated in. Morrison didn't stop him. Better to let it out now than have it eat at him later. Down the line, someone was crying quietly. Another Marine was laughing, that high-pitched, hysterical sound that came from surviving when you'd been certain you wouldn't. "Sound off!" Morrison called out, needing to know his people were alive. One by one, voices responded. Everyone in his section had made it through. The defensive positions had protected them just as Henderson had planned. Chen appeared out of the darkness, moving quickly down the line. His face was spattered with dirt and powder residue. "Casualties?" "Sections intact, sir. Few minor wounds, nothing serious. We held them." "We did more than hold them, Lieutenant. We broke them." Chen's voice was flat, emotionless. He was in that state Morrison recognized from previous battles, the commander mode, where feelings got locked away to be dealt with later. Initial estimates are devastating. They lost most of their assault force. Martinez crawled over from his position, Johnny Chen right behind him. Both looked shaken, but unhurt. "Captain, what do we do about the wounded out there?" Martinez gestured toward the valley, where cries for help echoed in Japanese. "Nothing. We hold position and maintain vigilance. This could be a ruse to get us to break cover." Chen's words were hard but necessary. Compassion in combat could get you killed. "Sir, some of them are just kids." Johnny's voice wavered. He was younger than his brother, barely 20, and this was his first major engagement. Captain Chen put a hand on his brother's shoulder. "I know, but our job is to keep our men alive. The moment we start caring more about enemy wounded than our own security is the moment we lose discipline. Stay in your position, stay alert. That's an order." The brothers locked eyes for a moment, some wordless communication passing between them. Johnny finally nodded and returned to his foxhole. Chen watched him go, and for just a second, Morrison saw the mask slip, saw the older brother worried about the younger one he was supposed to protect. "He'll be all right, sir," Morrison offered. "Will he? Will any of us?" Chen shook his head. "Get your men redistributed on ammunition. Check weapons, make sure nothing's fouled. If they regroup and come again, we need to be ready." As Chen moved on to the next section, Morrison began the post-combat routine. Collect brass casings. They'd need to police them up later. Check weapons for malfunctions. Redistribute ammunition from those who'd fired less to positions that had expended more. It was mechanical work, which was good. It gave the mind something to focus on besides the horror in the valley. Kowalski was staring at his bar, the barrel still smoking, despite having stopped firing 20 minutes ago. "I counted, Lieutenant. I counted my bursts. 43 times I pressed this trigger. 6 rounds per burst. That's 258 rounds. I hit with maybe 2/3 of them, being generous. How many men did I kill tonight?" "Mike, don't do that to yourself." "How many? I need to know. I need to quantify it somehow, make it real in my head instead of just this nightmare fog." Morrison crouched beside him. "You did your job. You followed orders. You protected your fellow Marines. That's what matters." "Is it? Because every one of those men I killed, they've got wives, kids, parents. They've got their own Sarahs and Tommies. And I ended them. We all did. They were trying to kill us, Mike. Given the chance, they would have butchered every Marine on this ridge. This wasn't murder. This was survival." Survival. Kowalski tested the word like it tasted wrong. "Yeah, I guess that's what we call it." But the night wasn't over. At 0100 hours, movement in the valley again, this time more cautious. Japanese soldiers trying to recover their wounded, pulling bodies back toward the tree line. Henderson's order was clear: do not engage unless they renew the assault. The Marines held fire, watching as the enemy attempted to salvage what they could from the disaster. Morrison watched through binoculars as small groups of Japanese soldiers moved among the fallen, checking for survivors, dragging wounded men toward the jungle. It was eerie, this humanitarian pause in the middle of a battle. These were still the enemy, still men who'd tried to kill him and his Marines hours ago. But in this moment, they were also just men trying to save their comrades, doing what any soldier would do. "Why aren't we firing?" Sullivan asked, his voice uncertain. "They're right there, exposed. Because the colonel ordered us not to, because there's a difference between defending ourselves and slaughtering men on a mercy mission. We're Marines, not murderers." Morrison lowered his binoculars. "Besides, letting them recover their wounded tells us something. It means they're not preparing for an immediate follow-up attack. They're trying to salvage what they can before withdrawing." The recovery operation took 30 minutes. Morrison counted 15 groups, each pulling back 2 or 3 wounded men. That meant at least 30 to 45 soldiers were still alive out there in the killing ground, too injured to move on their own. How many more were dead? The numbers were staggering to contemplate. Then at 0200, as Morrison had feared and Henderson had anticipated, a second assault. This time the Japanese had learned. They came in smaller groups, trying to use what cover existed, moving in rushes. But Henderson's defensive plan accounted for this too. Mortars broke up concentrations. Machine guns fired in short bursts, conserving ammunition but staying lethal. The second assault lasted 15 minutes before collapsing. This time, the casualties on the Marine side were higher. 2 men killed by accurate return fire from Japanese soldiers who'd found cover in shell craters from the first assault. 5 wounded, 1 seriously. The cost of victory was rising. Even in a battle they were winning decisively. Morrison pulled the dead men back from their positions, Marines whose names he'd known, whose stories he'd heard. Corporal Jenkins from Tennessee, who'd played harmonica and talked about opening a music shop after the war. Private Yamada from Hawaii, a Japanese-American who'd fought twice as hard as anyone to prove his loyalty. Both gone in seconds, killed by bullets that had found gaps in the sandbags. "Get them to the aid station," Morrison told Martinez. "Make sure Doc knows we've got a serious bleeder coming in." "Yes, sir." Martinez and Johnny Chen carefully lifted Jenkins onto a stretcher. The dead man's eyes were still open, staring at nothing. Johnny reached over and closed them gently, a small dignity in the midst of chaos. As they carried the bodies away, Sullivan approached Morrison. The young private's face was different now, harder. "Combat did that, aged you in hours rather than years. Lieutenant, I need more ammunition. I'm down to 2 magazines. Check Yamada's position. He won't need his anymore." The words felt callous, but that was the reality of combat. The dead equipped the living. Sullivan nodded and moved off. Morrison watched him go, wondering how much of the kid from Ohio would survive this war. Wondering the same thing about himself. The lull between the second assault and dawn was the worst period. Everyone was exhausted, running on adrenaline and fear. That was when mistakes happened, when vigilance slipped. Chen and Morrison moved constantly, keeping men alert, rotating positions so no one stayed static too long. Coffee appeared, brought up from the rear by Corman, who'd brewed it using precious fuel. It was bitter and lukewarm, but it was something to focus on besides the death in the valley. Morrison worked his section, redistributing ammunition, checking for casualties. Miraculously, their platoon had taken only light wounds. 2 men hit by wild shots, neither serious. The defensive positions and the lopsided nature of the engagement had protected them. The enemy had been forced to advance across open ground while Marines fired from covered positions. It was the military equivalent of bringing knives to a gunfight. At 0300, intelligence reports came through. Radio intercepts indicated the Japanese command was in disarray. Their assault force had been decimated. Estimates suggested 70 to 80% casualties. They were pulling back, abandoning the attack entirely. "We broke them," Chen said during a quick officers' meeting. His face was smudged with cordite and dirt. Henderson's plan worked. They committed to a mass assault thinking numbers would overwhelm us. Instead, they walked into a buzzsaw. "What are our losses?" Morrison asked. "Across the entire battalion, we're at 23 wounded, 5 seriously. No fatalities. They're casualties." Chen paused. "Initial estimates are over 1,800 dead or wounded. We won't know exact numbers until daylight." The mathematics were staggering. A force of 450 had inflicted catastrophic losses on a force of 2,000 while sustaining minimal casualties themselves. It wasn't because Marines were superhuman. It was because they'd had the discipline to follow a plan that seemed counterintuitive, the courage to let the enemy come close enough to touch before unleashing hell. Dawn came slowly, painting the valley in shades of grey, then gold. Morrison didn't want to look but couldn't help himself. The killing ground was exactly that. Bodies lay scattered across 300 yards, some alone, some in clusters where men had died trying to help each other. The grass was trampled flat, stained dark. Equipment lay everywhere, rifles and helmets and personal items that had meant something to someone just hours ago. The morning light revealed the true scale of the carnage. What had been shadowy shapes in darkness became distinct human forms. Morrison counted bodies near his sector alone and stopped at 50. Multiply that across the entire valley, and the numbers became almost incomprehensible. This wasn't combat in the clean, abstract sense. This was industrial-scale killing, enabled by tactical brilliance and defensive preparation. A chaplain moved through the Marine positions, offering what comfort he could. Father O'Brien was an older man, had served in the last war, understood what these boys had seen and done. He didn't offer platitudes or easy absolution. Instead, he sat with men, listened to them, let them talk or cry or rage as needed. When he reached Morrison's section, he spent extra time with Sullivan, who was still struggling with the weight of what he'd participated in. "Father, how do I reconcile this with everything I was taught? Thou shalt not kill." Love thy enemy. I violated all of it last night. O'Brien's response was quiet, but firm. You protected your brothers. There's no sin in that. The men who died out there, they made choices that led them here. Their commanders made choices that sent them into a trap. You didn't create this situation, you survived it. God understands the difference between murder and self-defense. Does he? Because I'm not sure I do anymore. That uncertainty, that wrestling with what you've done, that's what makes you human, son. Hold on to that. Don't let war turn you cold. Feel the weight of what happened, but don't let it crush you. Some men prayed. Others just sat, staring at nothing. Sullivan was crying quietly, his rifle across his lap. Morrison sat beside him, said nothing. Sometimes there were no words. The kid had killed men last night, probably a dozen or more given his position and the density of the enemy assault. That kind of weight didn't lift just because you'd been following orders or defending yourself. It stayed with you, changed you in ways you couldn't predict. Kowalski was disassembling his bar methodically, cleaning each component with an attention to detail that bordered on obsessive. It was his way of coping, Morrison realized. Focus on the mechanical, the controllable. Avoid thinking about the uncontrollable horror of what the weapon had been used for. The sergeant's hands were steady now, but Morrison noticed the slight tremor when he thought no one was watching. Around mid-morning, Henderson ordered a patrol into the valley to confirm casualties and gather intelligence. Chen selected a squad, including Morrison. They moved cautiously, weapons ready, alert for any Japanese soldiers who might still be alive and dangerous. What they found was worse than anyone had imagined. The casualties were overwhelming, bodies everywhere, in every position imaginable. Some had died instantly, cut down by machine gun fire. Others had lived long enough to try crawling to safety, marked by drag trails in the blood-soaked earth. Personal effects were scattered across the battlefield, photographs, letters, religious items. All the things soldiers carried to remember who they were beneath the uniform. Morrison picked up a photograph from beside one body. It showed a young Japanese soldier with an older couple, probably his parents, standing in front of a traditional house. Everyone in the photo was smiling. The soldier in the picture looked about Sullivan's age, with the same uncertain eyes of someone not quite comfortable in their own skin yet. Now he lay face down in Pacific mud. His war and his story ended by a bullet fired by a Marine who'd never know his name. "Don't do that to yourself, Lieutenant." Chen's voice was quiet, but insistent. "Don't humanize them. Not right now. You need to maintain some emotional distance or this will break you." "Too late, sir. They're already human. They were always human. That's what makes this so hard." Chen looked at the photograph in Morrison's hand, then out across the valley at the scale of the destruction. "Yeah, it is. But we did what we had to do. Remember that when the nightmares start. We did what we had to do to survive." The patrol counted over 400 bodies in the immediate kill zone. Intelligence estimated another 400 wounded had been pulled back during the recovery operations, and that perhaps 300 had escaped relatively unscathed. Of the 2,000 who'd started the assault, fewer than 400 were still combat effective. It was a catastrophic defeat by any measure. But the cost to the Marines, while significantly lower, wasn't negligible. 2 dead, 7 wounded seriously enough to require evacuation, another 16 with minor wounds, and psychological casualties that wouldn't be tallied for years, men who'd carry the weight of this night for the rest of their lives. Graves registration teams arrived by afternoon. The grim task of processing bodies beginning. The Marine dead were handled with care and dignity, wrapped in ponchos, dog tags collected, personal effects catalogued to be sent home. The Japanese dead were more complicated. Military protocol required identification when possible, burial with basic dignity. But the scale of casualties made individual processing impossible. Mass graves would be necessary. Morrison helped with the burial details for Jenkins and Yamada. They were interred in a temporary cemetery on the ridge, marked with crosses made from ration crate wood. Proper military burials would come later, if they came at all. For now, this was the best they could do. Father O'Brien said words over the graves, and the assembled Marines stood at attention, paying respects to brothers who'd fought beside them hours ago. "They died doing their duty," O'Brien intoned. "They died protecting their fellow Marines. They died so others might live. Greater love hath no man than this, that he laid down his life for his friends. May they rest in eternal peace." Sullivan broke down during the service, shoulders shaking with sobs he'd been holding back all day. Martinez put an arm around him, holding him up. No one judged. Everyone understood. They'd all lost friends, all carried the weight of survival when others hadn't. The tears were just another casualty of war, invisible but no less real. Colonel Henderson walked the line that morning, checking on his Marines. He was a tall man, graying at the temples, with eyes that had seen too much combat across too many years. When he reached Morrison's section, he paused, taking in the exhausted faces, the 1,000-yard stares that marked men who'd seen too much death in too short a time. "You held your fire, Lieutenant. That took guts." "We followed orders, sir." "Orders are easy to give. Following them when your instinct screams otherwise, when you think waiting might kill you, that's where character shows. You kept your men steady. That made the difference." Henderson looked out at the valley, at the burial details working below. "This doesn't feel like victory, does it?" "No, sir, it feels like slaughter." "Good. The day it does is the day you've lost something important." Henderson sat down on a sandbag, suddenly looking every one of his 53 years. "But understand this. Every man in this battalion is alive this morning because we had a plan and executed it perfectly. The enemy made assumptions based on numbers. We made decisions based on tactics. They thought mass was enough. We proved that discipline, position, and patience matter more. That lesson cost them dearly. Will they try again, sir?" "Not here. They can't afford another disaster like this. They'll shift their efforts elsewhere, try to find a weakness we haven't covered. Our job now is to hold this ridge and make sure there isn't one." Henderson pulled out a worn pipe, didn't light it, but just held it, a connection to normalcy. "I know what you and your men are feeling right now. I've been there. Every commander who's worth a damn has been there. The guilt of surviving when others didn't. The weight of the enemy dead. The question of whether we're still human after doing things like this." "Are we, sir, still human?" "That you're asking the question proves you are. It's the men who don't ask, who don't feel the weight. Those are the ones who've lost something essential." Henderson studied Morrison carefully. "You're going to have to help your men through this. Some will bottle it up, let it fester. Others will break down immediately. Both reactions are normal. Your job is to keep them functional while they process what happened. I'm not sure I'm qualified for that, sir. I'm barely keeping myself together." "None of us are qualified, Lieutenant. There's no training manual for this. You just do your best and hope it's enough." Henderson stood, preparing to move on to the next section. "One more thing. I'm recommending you for captain. We're expanding the battalion, need more company commanders. You've proven you can lead under pressure, keep men alive through your decisions. That's what command is." "Sir, I'm not sure I'm ready for that." "No one ever is, but you'll rise to it because you have to, because men will depend on you. That's how leaders are made, Morrison. Not in classrooms, but in moments like last night when everything depends on doing the right thing despite being terrified." Morrison watched Henderson move down the line, stopping to talk with other Marines, offering words of encouragement or simply presence. The man carried the weight of 450 lives on his shoulders, had made decisions that resulted in massive enemy casualties, and would have to live with those decisions for the rest of his life. Yet he still functioned, still led, still cared about his men. That was what command looked like in reality, stripped of glory and reduced to its essential core. responsibility. Over the next few days, the full scope of the victory became clear. Japanese casualties were confirmed at over 1,800 killed or wounded. They'd lost nearly their entire assault force. Marine casualties remained minimal in comparison. The battle became a case study in defensive tactics, used to train subsequent generations of officers in the value of patience, preparation, and discipline under pressure. But for the men who'd been there, who'd waited in the darkness, while 2,000 soldiers advanced to their deaths, the battle was something else entirely. It was proof that war rewarded not just courage, but calculated cold-bloodedness. That the willingness to let an enemy come close enough to ensure his destruction was as vital as the willingness to fight. The days following the battle took on a surreal quality. The Marines remained in their defensive positions, maintaining vigilance against a counterattack that never came. Intelligence confirmed the Japanese forces in the sector had been devastated, their command structure disrupted, their offensive capabilities shattered. Henderson Ridge had broken them not just tactically but psychologically. They'd believed in their numerical superiority, in the inevitability of their victory. That belief had been shattered in a few hours of disciplined defensive fire. Morrison spent those days watching his Marines process what they'd experienced. Sullivan threw himself into every task, volunteering for patrols, extra guard duty, anything to stay busy and avoid quiet moments where thought could intrude. He wrote letters to Betty every day, sometimes multiple letters, though Morrison suspected half of them never got sent. They were therapy, a way to maintain connection to the person he'd been before the night everything changed. Kowalski went the opposite direction. He became quieter, more withdrawn, did his job efficiently but without the camaraderie he'd shown before. Morrison would find him sometimes, just sitting and staring at nothing, lost in thoughts he wouldn't share. The sergeant's breakdown would come later, Morrison sensed. Right now, he was holding everything in through sheer force of will. But eventually that dam would break. Martinez and Johnny Chen became inseparable after the battle. Two men who'd shared trauma, forming a bond that transcended normal friendship. They'd been in adjacent positions during the assault, had watched each other's sectors, had saved each other's lives through coordinated fire. That created connections that civilian life could never replicate. Captain Chen noticed, but didn't interfere. His brother had found someone he could trust completely, and in combat, that was more valuable than gold. Morrison wrote home 3 weeks later, trying to explain what had happened. The letter went through multiple drafts, each attempt failing to capture the complexity of what he'd experienced. How did you tell your family you'd participated in slaughter, even justifiable tactical slaughter? How did you explain that saving lives required taking them in massive numbers? How did you convey the weight of watching 2,000 men walk into a trap you'd helped set? The final letter was simple, stripped of details that would only cause worry or couldn't be explained to people who hadn't been there. There was a major battle. We held our position against a much larger force. I'm safe. All my men are safe. I can't tell you more than that, but know that I'm doing my duty and thinking of you every day. Give my love to Dad. Tell him I understand now what he couldn't explain about his war. Some things you can only know by living them. His father's response arrived 6 weeks later, delayed by the vagaries of military mail. It was brief, written in the shaky handwriting of a man whose lungs were failing, but whose mind remained sharp. Son, whatever you had to do, whatever you saw, remember that survival isn't something to apologize for. You owe the dead respect and remembrance. You owe the living your continued service and eventual return. Don't confuse the two. Come home when you can. Your mother and I wait and pray. Sullivan got his letter from Betty around the same time. She'd sent a picture of herself in front of a house with a porch. I found it, she wrote. I put a down payment on it. When you come home, it'll be waiting. We'll be waiting. Whatever you've been through, whatever you've seen, it doesn't change how I feel. You're still my Tommy, and I'm still your Betty. We'll figure out the rest together." Sullivan carried that picture in his helmet from then on, his reason for surviving distilled into a simple image. Morrison saw him looking at it sometimes during quiet moments, his face softening from the hard mask combat had created. Love was an anchor in the chaos, a reminder that another world existed beyond the violence and death. For men like Sullivan, that reminder was everything. The battalion rotated off the line 4 weeks after the battle, sent to a rear area for rest and refit. It should have been a relief, a chance to recover from the sustained stress of frontline duty. Instead, many Marines found the transition difficult. They'd grown accustomed to constant vigilance, to the adrenaline of potential combat. The relative safety of the rear area felt wrong, almost guilty. Why were they resting when the war continued? Why were they safe when other Marines were still fighting? Morrison spent those weeks training new replacements, men fresh from the States who didn't yet understand what they were getting into. He tried to prepare them, to share the lessons of Henderson Ridge without traumatizing them before they ever saw combat. It was a delicate balance. They needed to understand the reality of war, the importance of discipline and preparation, but they also needed to maintain enough innocence to function, to not be paralyzed by fear of what they might have to do. "The most important thing," he told one group of replacements during a training session, "is to trust your training and trust your squad mates. When the bullets start flying, you won't have time to think. You'll react from instinct and muscle memory. So we drill until the movements are automatic. We prepare until every possible scenario has been war-gamed. And when the moment comes, you do your job and trust that everyone else is doing theirs." A young private, couldn't have been more than 18, raised his hand. "Sir, how do you handle the fear? I'm terrified just thinking about combat. How will I function when it's real?" Morrison considered the question carefully. Platitudes wouldn't help. These men needed honesty. "You don't stop being afraid, Private. Fear is what keeps you alive, makes you cautious when you need to be. What you learn is how to function despite fear, how to channel it into focused action. The first time will be the hardest. After that, you'll know you can survive it, and that knowledge makes the fear manageable. What if I freeze, sir? What if I let my squad down? Then your squad mates will cover for you until you unfreeze. That's what we do for each other. Nobody goes through this alone. The key is not freezing twice. Learn from that first moment, and the next time, you'll do better." The replacements looked uncertain, but slightly reassured. Morrison remembered having similar conversations with officers before Henderson Ridge, looking for reassurance that he'd be able to do what was required when the moment came. The truth was, you never really knew until you were tested. But preparation and training increased the odds that when tested you'd pass. Kowalski never talked about the battle. When asked, he'd shrug and change the subject. But Morrison noticed he'd started going to church services, sitting in back, never taking communion, but always present, finding perhaps a different way to process what they'd done and seen. Father O'Brien noticed too, made a point of checking in with the sergeant after each service, never pushing, but always available if Kowalski wanted to talk. One evening, Morrison found Kowalski sitting alone near the edge of camp, staring out toward the ocean. The sergeant didn't acknowledge his presence at first, so Morrison just sat down beside him in silence. Sometimes the best leadership was just being present. After a long while, Kowalski spoke. "You know what keeps me up at night, Lieutenant? It's not the killing. I mean, it is, but not in the way you'd think. It's how easy it was. How once the shooting started, they weren't people anymore. They were just targets, just shapes to aim at and drop. I was good at it, efficient, and that's what scares me, how easily I turned off the part of me that saw them as human beings. You did what you had to do to survive, Mike. To keep your brothers alive. I know. Intellectually, I know that. But knowing it and feeling it are different things. I keep thinking about Sarah, about my kids. What would they think if they knew how many men I killed that night? Would they still recognize me as the same person who left them? Morrison didn't have easy answers. The gulf between combat soldiers and civilians back home was vast, perhaps unbridgeable. The things they'd experienced, the choices they'd made, existed in a moral space that couldn't be explained to people who hadn't been there. They'll recognize the parts of you that matter, Mike. The part that loves them, that wants to build a good life with them. The rest, the war stuff, that's something you'll have to integrate into who you are. It doesn't define you unless you let it. How do you integrate being a killer, Lieutenant? How do you take that and make it fit with being a husband and father? I don't know. I honestly don't know. Maybe you never fully integrate it. Maybe it's always this separate thing you carry. But carrying it doesn't mean you're defined by it. You're more than the worst thing you've ever done, even when that worst thing was necessary. Kowalski nodded slowly, his eyes still fixed on the horizon. Father O'Brien says something similar. Says God judges the whole person, not just individual actions. That context matters, that intention matters. I want to believe that. I need to believe that. Then believe it. Because the alternative is drowning in guilt for choices you didn't really have. We were in that situation, Mike. We didn't create it. We responded to it the best way we knew how. That has to be enough, or we'll tear ourselves apart trying to find a perfection that doesn't exist in war. The battalion returned to combat 3 months after Henderson Ridge, this time in a different sector, facing different tactical challenges. Morrison had been promoted to captain as Henderson predicted, given command of a company that included Sullivan, Kowalski, Martinez, and many others who'd been on the ridge that night. They formed the core of his unit, veterans who'd proven themselves under the worst conditions imaginable. The nature of combat in the Pacific was grinding and relentless. Island after island, each requiring amphibious assault, followed by brutal fighting to root out defenders who'd fortified every cave and hilltop. The tactical lessons of Henderson Ridge remained relevant, but the constant rotation between intense combat and tense waiting took its toll on even the most resilient Marines. Sullivan earned a Silver Star for valor during an assault on a fortified position, charging a machine gun nest with nothing but a rifle and grenades when his squad was pinned down. He survived barely, taking shrapnel in his shoulder and leg. The wounds earned him a trip to a field hospital and eventually back to the States for recovery. Morrison visited him before he shipped out, found the young man from Ohio fundamentally changed by his experiences. "Betty's waiting," Sullivan said, his voice carrying a mixture of relief and uncertainty. "I'm going home to marry her, buy that house, try to build the life we talked about. But I'm not the same person who promised her those things, Captain. Will that be fair to her? She knows you've changed, Sully. The question is whether you've changed so much that you can't be with her anymore. Only you can answer that. I still love her. That hasn't changed. But I've got all this inside me now, all these memories and nightmares and guilt. How do I not let that poison what we have?" Morrison sat on the edge of Sullivan's hospital cot, choosing his words carefully. "You talk to her. You're honest about what you're carrying. You don't pretend to be the same kid who left Cleveland, but you also don't let the war be all you are. You fought so you could have a future with her. Don't let the fighting steal that future away. You owe it to yourself and to her to try." Sullivan nodded, tears forming in his eyes. "Thank you, sir, for everything. For keeping me alive on the ridge, for teaching me how to be a Marine, for treating me like I mattered. You did matter, Sully. You all mattered. That's why I pushed so hard, why I wouldn't let you quit even when things got difficult, because every one of you was worth saving. Now go home, marry Betty, have those 4 kids, and live well. That's an order." They shook hands, and Morrison left, knowing he'd probably never see Sullivan again. The war was fragmenting his unit, Men rotating out due to wounds or completing their tours, new replacements coming in who hadn't shared the experiences that bonded the original group. It was the natural progression of military service, but it felt like losing family members one by one. Kowalski stayed through the end of the war, fighting in 3 more major campaigns before the atomic bombs and Japanese surrender ended the conflict. By then, he'd been promoted to gunnery sergeant, was training new Marines himself, passing on the lessons learned at places like Henderson Ridge. When demobilization came, he was one of the last to leave, needing time to adjust to the idea that the war was actually over. Morrison remained in the Marines, part of the occupation forces in Japan, then eventually returned to the States for assignment at Quantico as an instructor. He'd made a career of military service, found that he couldn't quite picture himself in civilian life anymore. The structure, the sense of purpose, the brotherhood of Marines, all had become essential to his identity. The tactical lessons of Henderson Ridge spread through the Pacific Theater. Other units adopted similar defensive doctrines, trading space for time, using patience as a weapon. The Japanese, for their part, learned to be more cautious about mass assaults. But the human cost of that lesson had been profound. The battle was studied at military academies, dissected in after-action reports, used as a textbook example of proper defensive tactics, but those academic analyses missed something essential. They captured the what and the how, but never quite grasped the why in human terms. Why men were able to stand firm while thousands approached with lethal intent. Why discipline held when instinct screamed to act. Why trust in leadership overcame the natural impulse for self-preservation through premature engagement. Morrison, teaching at Quantico after the war, tried to convey these intangible elements to new officer candidates. The technical aspects were easy to explain. Fields of fire, interlocking sectors, pre-sighted coordinates. Any competent tactician could understand those. But how did you teach courage? How did you instill the kind of trust that let 450 Marines believe their colonel's unconventional plan would save rather than doom them? Leadership, he told one class of fresh-faced lieutenants, isn't about being the smartest person in the room or having all the answers. It's about earning trust through consistent, rational decisions. It's about showing your people that you value their lives as much as you value the mission. Colonel Henderson could order us to hold fire while the enemy approached because we trusted him completely. We knew he wouldn't waste our lives. That trust was built over months of training, through decisions big and small that showed he cared about us as individuals, not just as tactical assets. "But sir," one student asked, "what if you don't have months to build that trust? What if you're thrust into command during combat? Then you fall back on demonstrated competence and honesty. You admit what you don't know. You seek input from experienced NCOs. You make the best decisions you can with available information, and you own those decisions completely. Men can follow a leader who's uncertain but honest. They can't follow someone who pretends to know everything and leads them into disaster through false confidence." These lessons came from experience, from the crucible of Henderson Ridge and subsequent battles. Morrison had learned that leadership in combat was less about heroic gestures and more about steady, reliable decision-making, about keeping your head when everyone else was losing theirs, about making the hard calls and living with the consequences. He'd also learned that survival carried its own burden. Why had he lived when men like Jenkins and Yamada died? There was no good answer. Random chance, perhaps, the luck of positioning, bullets that missed by inches, all the arbitrary factors that separated survival from death in combat. The challenge was accepting that survival without drowning in survivor's guilt. 6 months later, Morrison was promoted to lieutenant colonel and given his own battalion to train. Henderson, now a brigadier general, came to the ceremony, one of the few times they'd seen each other since the war ended. The older man looked tired, aged more than the calendar would suggest. Command had taken its toll, the weight of all those decisions, all those lives etched into the lines of his face. After the ceremony, they shared a quiet drink in Morrison's new office. Henderson raised his glass. To the Marines of Henderson Ridge, those who lived and those who didn't. To Henderson Ridge, Morrison echoed. They drank in silence, both men lost in memories of a night years past, when everything had balanced on the edge of decision. "Do you ever regret it?" Morrison asked finally. "The order to hold fire? Knowing how close we came to being overrun if anything had gone wrong?" Henderson considered the question for a long moment. "Every day. But regret doesn't change necessity. Those men were coming to kill us. Given the choice between their deaths and ours, I chose ours. That's what command means. It means making decisions that let you live with yourself while ensuring your men live, period. You'll face similar choices now, James. Different circumstances, but the same fundamental equation. Will you be ready?" "I don't know if anyone's ever ready for that, sir." "No, they're not. But you'll do it anyway because that's what officers do. We carry the burden so our men don't have to. We make the hard calls and live with the nightmares so they can survive and go home to their families." Henderson stood, preparing to leave. "You'll do fine, Morrison. You've got good instincts and you care about your Marines. That combination will take you far. Just remember, the mission and the men are both important. The art is figuring out how to accomplish one without unnecessarily sacrificing the other." Morrison carried that conversation with him through the rest of his career. He fought in Korea, commanded a regiment, eventually made colonel himself. He lost men under his command, made decisions that saved some lives and cost others, carried the weight of leadership through peace and conflict. And always, in the back of his mind, was Henderson Ridge, the night that had defined him as a leader, that had shown him what he was capable of when pushed to the limit. Over the decades, as the surviving veterans of Henderson Ridge grew older, they stayed in touch through letters and occasional reunions. Sullivan and Betty did buy their house with the porch, had their 4 children, built a life in Cleveland that honored Sullivan's service without being defined by it. He taught history, coached Little League, served on the PTA, became a pillar of his community. The nightmares never fully stopped, but they became manageable, integrated into a life that had meaning beyond the war. Kowalski returned to Detroit and his factory job. He married his Sarah, raised Tommy and Maria, lived a quiet, dignified life characterized by hard work and steady reliability. He never spoke about the war to his children, but his grandchildren eventually coaxed stories from him late in his life. Stories he told carefully, honestly, without glorification, but also without shame. He'd done his duty, served his country, survived horrors most people couldn't imagine. That was worth remembering, even if it wasn't worth celebrating. Martinez became a teacher like Sullivan, but in Los Angeles, where he'd grown up. He taught English and history to immigrant kids, many of them Japanese-American, children and grandchildren of people who'd been interned during the war. It was his way of reconciling the paradox of having fought against Japan while being friends with Japanese-Americans like Johnny Chen. The war had been against a regime, not a people, and Martinez made sure his students understood that distinction. Johnny Chen followed his brother into a military career, eventually making major before retiring. He and Martinez remained close, visiting each other regularly, 2 men whose friendship had been forged in shared terror and survival. Captain Chen himself rose to colonel, served with distinction through Korea, and retired with honors. But like all of them, he carried Henderson Ridge with him, a defining moment that both validated and haunted him. Father O'Brien continued his chaplain work through the Korean War before retiring to a parish in Boston. He stayed in touch with many of the Henderson Ridge veterans, providing spiritual counsel to men who struggled with what they'd experienced and done. He understood, perhaps better than most clergy, that faith in combat was complicated, that men could serve God while doing things that weighed on their souls. His role was to help them find peace with those contradictions. Henderson himself retired as a Major General, taught at the Naval War College, consulted on defensive strategy, and wrote extensively on military tactics, but he never forgot the human cost of his decisions. In his later years, he established a scholarship fund for children of Marines killed in action, a quiet way of honoring those who'd fallen under his command. It was his form of penance, perhaps, or at least acknowledgement that tactical brilliance came at a price paid by others. 6 months later, Morrison was promoted to captain and given his own company. The night before he took command, Henderson called him to headquarters. The colonel looked older, the war grinding him down year by year. "You're ready for this, James. You proved it on the ridge. I just followed your orders, sir. You did more than that. You understood why those orders mattered. That's what makes a good officer. Any fool can give commands, understanding the why behind them, being able to explain it to scared kids who just want to live long enough to go home. That's the art of leadership." "Sir, can I ask you something? That night when you gave the order to hold fire, were you certain it would work?" Henderson was quiet for a moment. "Certain? No. Confident? Yes. There's a difference. I'd run the calculations, studied the terrain, wargamed every scenario I could think of. The math favored our approach, but math doesn't account for human factors. What if my Marines panicked and broke fire discipline? What if the Japanese split their force differently than projected? What if their artillery support was better than intelligence indicated? A dozen variables could have turned my plan into a disaster. But you gave the order anyway. Because the alternative was worse. Fighting them in the jungle, in close quarters, with their numbers advantage. We'd have been ground down eventually. The ridge gave us a chance to use terrain and tactics to overcome numbers. Sometimes command means choosing between bad options and worse ones, then living with the consequences. Do you ever regret it? The casualties? Every day. But regret doesn't change necessity. Those men were coming to kill us. Given the choice between their deaths and ours, I chose ours. That's what command means. It means making decisions that let you live with yourself while ensuring your men live. Period. Morrison carried that conversation with him through the rest of the war. He fought in 3 more major engagements, led his company through some of the Pacific Theater's bloodiest fighting. He lost men, good men, and each loss carved something away from him. But he never lost sight of the lesson Henderson taught on that ridge. Patience, preparation, and the willingness to make hard choices saved more lives than impulsive bravery ever could. When the war ended, Morrison went home to Chicago. His father was still alive, still carrying his gas-scarred lungs from the previous war. They sat on the back porch one evening, both men understanding that some experiences couldn't be translated into words, but could be shared through silence. "Was it worth it?" his father asked finally. Morrison thought about Sullivan, who'd married his Betty and bought his house with the porch. About Kowalski, who'd gone back to Detroit and his factory job, finding peace in routine. About the 1,800 Japanese soldiers who died in a valley on a small Pacific island, most of whose names he'd never know. About the 450 Marines who'd lived because a colonel had the courage to devise an unconventional plan and the men to execute it. "I don't know if wars are ever worth it, Dad, but some battles have to be fought, and when they do, you fight them with everything you have, with every advantage you can create. We were lucky. We had a commander who understood that, and men willing to trust him even when it felt wrong." "The waiting," his father said. "That was the hardest part, wasn't it? Knowing they were coming and having to let them come close." Morrison looked at him, surprised. "How did you know?" "Because it's always the waiting that's hardest. The anticipation. The moments before it starts when your mind runs through every horrible possibility. Once the shooting starts, training takes over. But the waiting, that's when you find out what you're made of. They sat in silence after that, two veterans from two wars, understanding that courage came in many forms. Sometimes it was charging into fire, sometimes it was holding fire when everything in you screamed to shoot. Both required facing fear, but one required facing it while doing absolutely nothing, trusting in a plan and a commander and the discipline of the men around you. Years later, when military historians studied the Battle of Henderson Ridge, they focused on the tactical innovations, the effective use of terrain, the disciplined fire control. They pointed to it as an example of how well-prepared defensive positions could overcome numerical superiority. All of that was true, but what they couldn't capture in their analyses and reports was the human element. The fear that Morrison and his Marines faced, watching 2,000 enemy soldiers approach while being ordered not to shoot. The trust required to follow an order that seemed designed to get them killed. The psychological weight of inflicting such massive casualties, even on an enemy trying to kill them. Sullivan became a teacher after the war, taught history to high school students. He never talked much about his combat experience, but every year on the anniversary of Henderson Ridge, he'd spend the day quietly at home, thinking about the night he'd prayed his rosary in a foxhole while death approached across a dark valley. His 4 kids knew something significant had happened to their father in the war, but they were adults before he finally told them the full story. Kowalski worked his factory job for 30 years. He was a good employee, reliable, quiet, kept to himself mostly. Once, a younger co-worker asked if he'd seen action during the war. Kowalski looked at him for a long moment, then said, "I did my duty. That's all that matters." He never elaborated. Henderson retired as a general, taught at several military academies, wrote papers on defensive tactics that became required reading. But the battle that defined his career was the one where he'd gambled, that patience would prove deadlier than immediate action, and where 450 Marines had trusted him enough to let 2,000 enemy soldiers approach before unleashing hell. He never glorified what happened that night. When asked about it in interviews and lectures, he always emphasized the price paid on both sides. "War is sometimes necessary," he'd say, "but it's never glorious." What we did on Henderson Ridge was tactically brilliant and strategically sound. It was also a tragedy. 1,800 men died in a few hours because their commanders sent them into a situation they couldn't win. Our victory came from their mistakes as much as our preparations. That's not something to celebrate. It's something to learn from and hope we never have to repeat. Morrison stayed in the Marines, made it to lieutenant colonel before retiring. He trained new generations of officers, always emphasizing the same lessons. Know your terrain, prepare thoroughly, have the discipline to follow the plan even when your instinct rebels. Trust your men and give them reasons to trust you. Violence, when necessary, should be overwhelming and decisive, not prolonged and uncertain. But beyond tactics, he tried to teach something harder. That command meant accepting responsibility for decisions that would haunt you. That saving lives sometimes required taking them. That courage wasn't fearlessness, but acting despite fear. That patience could be harder than action, but more effective. On the 50th anniversary of the battle, the few surviving veterans of Henderson Ridge gathered for a reunion. There were only 17 of them left. Sullivan came, now in his 70s, still married to Betty, grandfather to 9. Kowalski was there, frailer than Morrison remembered, but still carrying himself with that factory worker steadiness. They met at a VFW hall in San Diego, these old men who'd been terrified young Marines together. They spent the day remembering, not just the battle, but the men who hadn't made it home from other fights, the friends lost to subsequent combat or to the long peace that followed. They talked about their lives, their families, their careers. And late in the evening, when most had left or dozed off in chairs, Morrison and Kowalski and Sullivan sat together. 3 men who'd shared something that could never be fully expressed, but would always connect them. "You ever think about them?" Sullivan asked. "The Japanese soldiers, I mean. Wonder who they were." "Every time I look at my grandkids," Morrison admitted. "Some of those men probably had kids too. Probably had Bettys of their own waiting for them. They just had the bad luck to be on the other side and have commanders who sent them into a meat grinder." "War's a rotten business," Kowalski said. "We did what we had to do. Doesn't mean it sits easy." "Henderson was right, though," Morrison said, "about choosing between bad options and worse ones. If we'd fought them differently, more of us would have died. Maybe all of us. I can't regret making the choice that brought us home, even knowing what it cost them." They sat quietly after that, 3 old men remembering a night 70 years gone when they'd been young and terrified and had done something remarkable because someone had asked it of them and they'd found the courage to comply. The night when the Marines had turned off their guns, not from mercy but from tactics, waiting for the perfect moment to unleash devastation. The night that proved patience could be the deadliest weapon of all. As they left the reunion, Morrison realized that the true lesson of Henderson Ridge wasn't about tactics or terrain. It was about trust. The trust between commanders and their men. The trust between soldiers sharing foxholes in the dark. The trust that when you're asked to do something that seems insane, there's a reason and a plan, and the men asking know what they're doing. That trust, earned and maintained, was what turned 450 scared Marines into a force that could defeat 2,000 because they'd believed in the plan, even when every instinct screamed otherwise. War would continue to evolve. Technology would change how battles were fought, but some principles remained constant. Preparation mattered, position mattered, discipline mattered. And sometimes, the hardest thing soldiers could do was nothing at all, waiting with weapons ready while danger approached, trusting that patience would be rewarded with victory. Morrison died at 89, surrounded by family. His last coherent words were to his grandson, a young Marine himself, heading to his first deployment. "Remember," Morrison whispered, "courage isn't about having no fear. It's about having fear and doing your duty anyway. Trust your leaders if they've earned it. Trust your training always. And understand that sometimes the right action is patience. Sometimes the bravest thing you can do is wait." His grandson carried those words with him, along with the story of a night on a Pacific island when his grandfather and 449 other Marines had demonstrated that discipline could defeat numbers, that preparation could overcome chaos, and that sometimes turning off your guns until the perfect moment was deadlier than firing them immediately. The night when waiting had saved lives and patience had proven to be the ultimate weapon.